ora, and welcome back to another episode of Both Sides Now with your hosts Alex Martin and Eve McCullum. We break down politics with the goal to break down political polarisation and get you interested in the issues that matter. This week we have plenty to talk about, including racism in Parliament, national ruling out working with opportunity, youth unemployment, and AI data centres. As always, though, let's check in with how Eve's doing. Eve, you're across the ditch this weekend.
Yes, I have. As we were time of recording this, literally just landed in the Gold Coast, which is lovely here for a holiday. It's sunny and warm, which I'm very excited about. And I also just want to give a quick shout out. I listened to the Izzy Dag podcast with Between Two Beers on the flight over, and it's a really interesting listen. I definitely recommend everyone should give it a listen. Very impressive how vulnerable Izzy was and how honest he was. And I also think as well, I also give a shout out to his wife Daisy, because there's some quite personal stuff he discusses, and the fact that she's allowed him to share sort of his journey, the journey they've been on, and his family as well. I thought was really cool. So yeah, it deals with, I guess, a bit of a trigger warning, but it does deal with addiction. But yeah, fantastic episode, and I feel like there's something in there for everybody, and it sort of traverses Izzy's career and his mental health issues that he's had post being an All Black.
That's awesome. So very much into the sports. Nice little listen over the way across the Tasman. How good. Speaking of sports, have you been keeping up with the Commonwealth Games over the past fortnight or so?
Loosely, probably not as much as I guess most New Zealanders would think we should be. I think the Commonwealth Games probably is becoming a little bit less relevant. But so cool to see Zoe Hobbs win gold in 100 metre sprint. I think she's the first Kiwi to ever win a gold in 100 metre sprint. And I also thought this Liza McCartney won gold in the pole vault, and Imogen Ayres, I think that's how you pronounce her name, she got bronze, so that was really cool to see as well. So lots of the women doing super well. How have you been following it?
I have been loosely watching. It's kind of, I guess, at a niggly time for us, the Glasgow time here. I guess we get a bit of an opportunity to watch it in the evenings and then a little bit in the mornings. So I guess it's been a little bit tricky to keep pace of it, but I have been watching some sort of interesting dialogue unfold online when it comes to the Commonwealth Games, in particular, our netballers. Have you seen anything along this lines, Eve?
No, I haven't actually seen that.
Well, one thing I found really interesting to unfold is both the New Zealand players and the Australian players, obviously both doing really, really well with the netball. Yet to see a winner for the netball and get some medals. But I found a lot of the online dialogue really revolving around their dresses. Now, I just find this really surprising because, like, it just seems to me that shouldn't be the focus of our attention. I guess for the Silver Ferns, they're this year wearing a grey coloured dress, which is sort of being hailed back to the infamous 2007 Rugby World Cup jersey, which we shall not talk about. And then for the Australian Diamonds, lots of chat about the length of their dresses and how they sort of like keep tugging them down when they're playing and stuff. A couple of views on this. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to highlight that the typical sort of dress codes in sports for women have been restrictive or sexualized or uncomfortable, and I think that does perhaps deserve some attention as we move towards a more sort of equitable and comfortable dress code. But I'm also just so disappointed that this is the dominating discussion when I feel like the focus should be on the sport. And I don't know, maybe that's just what my For You pages and algorithms have been pushing to me. I've also seen lots of really cool videos sort of breaking down the plays and showing what the players are doing well. Certainly some things I'll keep in mind for my social netball games. But yeah, just something really interesting I've noticed. And I'm kind of like, it's not really the point. Okay, let's crack into some of the things that we want to talk about. I guess let's quickly get out of the system some of the news that's been dominating this week's headlines. Winston Peters and the racism in Parliament. Eve, what do you reckon about this?
Oh, I think it's pretty appalling. And I guess for those of you who might not have heard, in the House, Winston Peters said to Green MP Lawrence, I'm going to pronounce his last
Junan.
name, Junan, basically told him to go back to where he came from, which is completely inappropriate. He has been in New Zealand for over 30 years, if I'm
Yeah,
correct. Yeah, so
Chinese-born New Zealander
yeah,
in
yeah,
1994, I think he's been in New
yeah.
Zealand.
So he's been here, like, I mean, been here longer than you and I've been alive, right?
Quite.
Um, so he's made a massive contribution to New Zealand society. So yeah, this is just pretty disturbing from Winston Peters, and I think it sort of comes after a long line of other comments we've heard made, or inappropriate comments we've heard made from New Zealand First. So Shane Jones' infamous butter chicken tsunami comment, and you've got Shane Jones' reference to the Indian Prime Minister and talking about knee pads and our relationship with the Prime Minister and the Indian Prime Minister. So it's pretty disappointing to see. Yeah, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, pretty appalling. I think Winston Peters said, "I know you just came here 5 minutes ago. Go back to your own country. That's where they lie like a flatfish, but they don't lie like that here, all right? This is called democracy, unlike what you're used to." Just appalling stuff. I actually thought former Prime Minister Helen Clark, when she was interviewed on RNZ's Morning Report on Friday morning, summed it up quite well. That she said, quote, "Firstly, it seems to me that the behaviour of New Zealand First and of their leader and of Shane Jones has for some time been inviting a sacking, inviting a breakup of the coalition, and frankly, so close to an election campaign, that's probably, neither here nor there." And then she sort of follows that by saying, "But there's also a point of view which says he's not only inviting a sacking, he's inviting attention, so don't give it to him. But actually, in the end, if you say nothing, you seem complicit." So it's a real fine line, I think, to walk when it comes to calling out this behaviour, because it has to be called out. Say no to racism, give nothing to racism. But then, by doing so, it just stirs up the sort of media attention for New Zealand First, and that's where they're drawing their voters from these people who sort of align with that sort of thing and like that sort of outspoken view. Just on the call for Winston Peters to be sacked, look, I agree. I'd love to see him go. Don't get me wrong. You can't, as a minister, as a shared deputy prime minister, you can't say shit like that. It's blatantly racist. Absolutely no time for that. But I don't know whether sacking Winston Peters would help or hinder this government and going towards an election.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's easy for the left to come out and say he should be sacked. I mean, it's appalling behaviour, and if a national MP had said that, they would absolutely be sacked. But Christopher Luxon has come out and said that it is racist. He's completely, he's not at all in support of these comments. I thought that was really well done by him. But we're in a tricky coalition agreement. The election's, I think, just over 3 months away. He's not going to be sacked. And he might not even actually believe this stuff. He's 100% just doing it to appeal to his voter base, which is unfortunately growing. So I think, yeah, I mean, an ideal world you should sack him, but it's just not going to happen. Yeah.
I know, pretty grim. I saw a different take on my social media this week from the social media user Conspiracy of Equals, whom I follow on TikTok, and I really thought this was a really good take. He said in a TikTok video posted this week that this is all an act. Winston is doing and saying this racist crap in his ministerial position as it is as foreign minister to drive a wedge between New Zealand and China to support US foreign policy. We've seen, I guess, over the past 3 years, this kind of cozying up to the United States, who is our second largest trade partner after China, of course. And Peters is sort of growing that relationship with the United States in place of investment in the South Pacific. But Peters is also doing this, as you say, like for himself, spouting this anti-China rhetoric to pull in more voters, the same way he does with, I guess, like the anti-vaxxers we saw a few years ago. So yeah, I just shout out to Conspiracy of Equals. I thought that's quite a good take to have. It's all an act. And he says our multicultural population and our economy are getting caught in the crossfires.
Yeah, I actually also, as well, on the sort of takes and responses to this on social media. Not that I agree with a lot of her views, but I did see an interesting post from Annie O'Brien where she sort of clipped together different other comments that other politicians have made. Because I think also during this week in the House, Tamatha Paul called English a bastard language. And then she also referred to the comments that Taku Taiwhere's made during the by-election last year or earlier this year, in reference to some whole lot of Labour people who were campaigning for that seat, and there were Indians and people of other races. So I think, there's a little bit of a trend here. It's not just New Zealand first, like other politicians are making race-related comments, which I think is really unhelpful. And so I think it's important to this is not at all excuse Winston's behaviour, but he's not the only one. So I think it is careful to, we need to be careful and, watch out with what other people are saying too. I think all politicians could do with considering who they target their comments at.
Yeah, I agree. Zero tolerance policy for any of this sort of stuff. I think that's the fairest way to apply it.
100%.
Okie dokie. Let's turn on to the real substance of this week. I wanted to speak to youth unemployment in New Zealand. Have you recently graduated and are struggling to get a job? Have you been told that you don't have enough experience? Are you battling thousands of others just to get into one role? Or perhaps you've invested tens of thousands of dollars into a tertiary qualification just to graduate to see that there are no jobs for you. And perhaps you're looking across the Tasman. Well, you wouldn't be alone. Unemployment in New Zealand is at its highest in a decade, sitting at 5.3%, but the youth unemployment rate is nearly 3 times that. In May, Stats New Zealand released data to show that the NEET, or the Youth Not in Employment, Education or Training, rate was at 14.4%. Now, I actually understand that this data, that one was released in May, that this data should hopefully be updated in the next week or so. So I'll be keeping my eyes peeled to see whether there are any positive or negative changes in the last sort of quarter. But I think this is a really concerning statistic for our young people. We know how hard it is to afford to live at the moment, regardless of whatever age or stage you're at. But I think it's particularly difficult for young folk who just want to get a good start in their working careers, but the jobs aren't there.
Yeah, so I have been having a look at this, and I guess, the first thing I would say is really tough if you're graduating at the moment, and I completely acknowledge that. But then I started thinking a little bit deeper about this, because I think we probably are due to have a conversation around what young people are actually studying and what skills do we need them to have so they can adapt to the modern working environment. Because obviously with AI coming in, we're going to have potentially a huge change in the job market. I don't subscribe to the fact that I think AI is going to completely get rid of all jobs and no one's going to be able to find a job. I don't subscribe to that. Maybe I'm being naive, but I think that we are just definitely going to change the way we work. And I can see that in my profession, being a lawyer, there's a lot of stuff with what I do that AI can do, but there's also a lot of stuff that AI can't do, and I don't really foresee it being able to. Again, could be being naive. But also, I think it's got me thinking about, what new jobs will arise because of AI. So I know a friend of a friend, he has set up a company which is helping businesses put AI solutions in. So he and his mate have essentially given themselves a new income stream because of AI. They're advising businesses on AI. So I think we've seen that's an example, I guess, of where, new opportunities are arising. And I think that's also an interesting question to come back to university. Because I do wonder, and probably people hate me for saying this, but is it actually still worthwhile spending $30,000 or $40,000 getting a BA in communications or a BA in psychology? Is it actually preparing young people in the right place to get a job? So I think that there's probably a broader conversation that we need to have here. And it's not going to fix the here and now issue that youth unemployment is really high, but I think it's something that we need to have relatively quickly around the changing work environment.
Interesting take. Yeah, I think sort of on the AI stuff, I think what is probably quite concerning for young people is that as AI begins to infiltrate our workplaces for good or for bad, probably for good for the most part, is that it's beginning to soak up that sort of entry level jobs and the mahi
Yeah.
that you do as a graduate or even as an intern. And so I don't think the labour market at the moment is sort of offering more for young people as they enter into their first sort of positions and things. Um, interesting as well on whether we need to have a discussion about what qualifications are worthwhile. I know a lot of universities have had to make a lot of cuts recently to specific courses that clearly aren't financially viable anymore, and some of that stuff I see really disadvantageous. I know um, I graduated with a major in Spanish in my arts degree, and I know since graduating, a lot of the courses that I took in my undergraduate degree aren't on offer anymore, and that's a second language like Spanish, you know. And I see that as quite a valuable skill for people who might want to work internationally or even nationally with a Spanish sort of lens. But that's just an example. I don't know. I think university is incredible for having teaching people critical analysis skills, and I think that that is something that is genuinely needed still forever. It always will be. So I wouldn't want to impose anything that might hinder that sort of critical analysis and those skills that you take and knowledge that you take into the workforce.
Yeah, I guess a couple of points I'd say on that is I think first, I think the labour market is going to have to figure out how they adjust to, because if you don't have grads, you don't have people that are learning those core skills of the business. So if AI is taking over that, as essentially the grad level just going to be the level above,
Mm.
because how are you, at some point you're going to run out of people who have any knowledge of the business, so you're going to have to look elsewhere. So it'll be interesting to see how the labour market adjusts to that. And I think my second point I'd say in terms of universities, I think that critical analysis stuff is still super important. But at the end of the day, if it's not the critical analysis that the job market is looking for and people can't get jobs, then what is and this is, again, I'm going to upset people here, but what is the point of learning it? And so, look, if you can afford to go and spend 30K and learn something because it's fun, absolutely. But most of us come out of university with a huge student loan, and I personally, I've got a law degree and then my BA's in communications and politics. I got about 2 weeks into doing my BA in communications and politics and realised I wasn't going to get a job in doing that, and so I picked up my law degree. So I think, university is kind of like, it needs to be a mix of enjoy what you're learning, but also you've got to pay back this big loan. And I think that's a conversation that's going to have to be had. And I know when we were at university, I think it was the art history department at Otago got cut. There were definitely, those conversations were going on even when we were at university, and that was, 5 years ago now. So
Whoa,
yeah, there's
whoa,
going to have to be some tough conversations. Yeah, I know, feeling old, but
yeah.
yeah, I think there's going to have to be the reality is going to be some tough conversations.
Mm.
But I think the other interesting thing as well that saw came out this week, sort of along the same lines, is TikTok have released an report that Infometrics New Zealand did, basically looking at how TikTok influences business in New Zealand and how, I guess, TikTok is helping people in New Zealand to earn more money. And what I thought was really, really interesting that came out of this. So for those who don't know, TikTok has kind of become as independent as a platform, and it's become massive for the creator economy. They reckon that TikTok supports over 9,700 jobs in New Zealand, and it has an estimated 411,000 Kiwis who identify as content creators. So content creators are essentially, I guess, the term that's used for influencers, if they don't want to be called influencers, because it's kind of become a bit of, I guess, a not so endearing term. But if you think about it, again, I think influencers or content creators is a really good example of how the way in which we work is changing. Because I essentially, even though I personally don't think influencing is a real career, but I do think it's, in another breath though, it is actually a modern form of marketing.
Yeah,
Because if you look at a
totally.
lot of brands now, brands aren't necessarily putting as many big ad billboards up, and they're not putting ads on TV, and they're not putting so much in newspaper. They're actually going to people on these social platforms and saying, hey, let's collaborate, and they pay them. And I've got a few friends to do it, and you can make an eye-watering amount of money. So, as I said, as much as I'm like, ooh, some days I'm like, this could be more fun than what I do. So I think, again, it's an example of showing how we're changing the way in which we work. And so I think that is stuff that, yeah, we've got to be prepared to move with the times. And so, whilst youth unemployment is really high now, I think that people are getting creative, and a lot of content creators are younger people. Now, obviously not people with a a degree in chemistry or a degree in art history aren't necessarily going to be content creators, but I just think that I think it's a good example of showing innovation and people looking at different ways to earn income.
100%. I think that's really interesting, some really cool insights. I wonder where whether that, I guess because TikTok is like an online platform, right? Whether they're taking the clippings of some of these creators and able to bolster their own shareholders, I guess, rather than kind of coming back into the New Zealand economy. Do you think that's an issue at all?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's probably all sorts of concerns around where the data and where that information is going. Absolutely, but I think that's an issue we're kind of grappling with a lot of areas, and I think I had an interesting along the same line of AI and looking at that sort of stuff around as we move into this more digital online world. And a world where I guess it kind of favours those with capital, so potentially there are a few that sort of have the power, continue to earn lots and lots of money. What do we do about that? And Fran O'Sullivan, I heard, made a really interesting comment maybe a few weeks ago now, but saying like, is there a world in which the people who own these big AI companies or own TikTok or the social medias actually required to pay a whole lot more tax, and then we potentially it's not a UBI, but it's something like a UBI that the money comes back into everyday taxpayers' hands, because essentially AI and social media is taking so much money from us. Is this a way in which we deal with it going forward to try and not just enable a few to get incredibly wealthy and whilst they take a whole lot of jobs off people?
Interesting. Yeah. I think that kind of feeds in a little bit to a survey that I read this week from Deloitte. They did a global 2026 Gen Z and millennial survey, which found that 2/3 of Gen Z and millennials delay life decisions over finances. I'm not shocked by this. The
Yeah.
survey found that housing affordability impacted the career decisions of 72% of Gen Z and
Well,
70% of millennials. So, yeah, it's interesting that sort of like wealth circle and I guess like where that money kind of goes and where it sits. Yeah, I would consider myself part of that 72%. Ain't no way I could afford a house deposit. Despite, like I invest as much as I can into my KiwiSaver and I put away as much as I can each pay cycle into savings. But this report also found that half of Gen Z and millennials are living paycheck to paycheck, which, like, yeah, also relatable. And very quickly, before we move on, I just wanted to touch on another thing that I think is impacting youth unemployment or will impact youth unemployment, and that is the current government's decision to restrict the job seeker benefit for those aged 18 and 19. So this is a law change that will come in effect in November 2026, where essentially if you are 18 or 19 years old and your parents earn $65,000 a year, government says we're not going to support you on the job seeker benefit, your parents have to support you. And this is something that I find quite concerning, especially because 2,700 of those young people, 18, 19-year-olds, are either unwell, have a disability, or an injury. And I would have reasonably expected that that sort of support would be there. Now, look, I do see where this policy idea has come from. We don't want people entering into their adulthood, starting out on welfare and getting trapped on welfare. But if that's the case, there needs to be support for these people by other means, because parental support, $65,000 a year, if that's what their parents make, is not a lot at all. And I just don't really see this as setting people up for the future. I feel like this is setting up young people to fail. And I also foresee that this might push young people into entering study with, absolutely no idea what they want to do, taking on huge amounts of debt just to get living costs as well. And as we've discussed before, you touched on briefly, right? We've already acknowledged that some of those living costs are barely enough to get by, especially if you live in a centre like Auckland. So yeah, I don't really see how at age 18 it's enough for you to be considered an adult, but the government says you're not adult enough to be part of the welfare system, even if you need it.
Yeah, this is the interesting one. I think I've definitely bounced backwards and forwards on if I support it or not, and I probably still sit a little bit on the fence. I think if you put aside the ones who are unwell, I think that's slightly problematic. But I think the statistics do show that if you get on the benefit when you're really young, you're likely to stay on it for 10 or 20 years. So I think part of what the government is trying to achieve here is to try and not let young people get on the benefit in the first place. Now, I do see your point when you say, oh, look, you don't want them to get into study if they're not sure what they're going to do. That's fine. But I think, if they do come out of school and they sort of start doing not much, then that becomes quite problematic because the stats show they could potentially be on welfare for a very, very long time. I think the way to probably get around that point, around the study point, is more work needs to go at helping these young people when they're in school, show them the different routes. The government's announced this year at the budget a whole lot more trade places. Like industry areas like the police, they are regularly recruiting for more people. We've also got universities, so I think more work needs to probably be done while these kids are at school, so they can clearly see the pathways. Because I don't know about you, but when my high school I went to up in Northland did not have a particularly good guidance counsellor around helping with this sort of stuff. So these kids might not even have access to be able to know. But it's also been some of the chat around, and I've heard what's interesting comments, is that other young people who are studying can't have access to the benefits. They've got their living costs, but I think the living costs are less than what you'd get on a benefit. So I think one of the comments was around, well, why are we giving people that are not doing much more money than those who are studying? So again, interesting comments around that. I think the $65,000 is really, really low. I'm not sure how they came to that number. It's always going to be an arbitrary number, but it does seem really low. And obviously, there are just people who end up in tough situations. Shit happens, for want of a better phrase. But it'll be interesting to see when this gets going how it goes. I think I'm kind of going to wait and see if it actually fixes the problem or if it sort of just creates more harm.
Yeah, I think another thing as well is that it just doesn't feel like the jobs are out there for these young people to get into. And I just feel like that's a real rock and a hard place if there aren't any jobs to jump into and then you can't even get welfare support from it. I think the student job search chief executive Louise Savica said that student job search have never seen a student work environment like this before, saying that application rates are the highest we've ever seen in student job searches data records over 40 years, and saying that in the past financial year, it had 434,000 applications for just 53,000 positions. So guys, it is hard out there.
Yeah, it's tough. And I think I would also acknowledge as well, when you kind of go through a tough economic cycle, the labour market is one of the last things to recover because you've essentially got the lag. Everything else has to get going first so that businesses can figure out, okay, well, these are the sort of jobs they will have available. So I think even though we are starting to see some of the other stats in the economy start to get better, inflation's coming down, interest rates have come down, the labour market is one of the last things to respond. So it is just really tough. And I think, as I discussed earlier, that coupled with the sort of beginnings of AI, it is really hard for young people. So I'm very grateful to have a job at this stage of my career. So yeah, I think there's no magic wand, unfortunately, I think we can wave at trying to fix this problem. I thought now we would move on to discuss the Opportunity Party again, because you might have seen in the news this week that Prime Minister Christopher Luxon, I think kind of accidentally on purpose,
I think he made an oopsie.
I think he'd been thinking about it, but I don't know if it was meant to be announced at that time in that way. But he came out and has ruled out National going with Opportunity in a coalition agreement post the election. So I have a few thoughts on this. First and foremost, I'm not sure if anyone quite believes that if it came down to it, Christopher Luxon wouldn't pick up the phone to Kulei Wong. I think that everyone on today, politicians want to be in government, and he would. I also think as well, National need to almost stop talking about opportunity, because every time they talk about opportunity, they get more into a whole other news cycle. So, and Christopher Luxon being the Prime Minister, what he says carries a lot of weight. And so, of course, the media are going to go and talk to Kulei Wong. So it's meant that this story's been in the news all week. Hell, it's meant that we're talking about it now, right? Like, if he hadn't done that, we wouldn't be talking about opportunity in this podcast episode,
Totally.
I feel like the more that the Prime Minister talks about them, the less, the more time they get. And we see all that as well. Other political parties haven't really been talking about them. That's kind of
Yeah.
seemed to, let it happen. And I think that's why I think this might have been on accident, because I wonder if it's something that might have happened closer to the election. I also, as a National Party voter, would so much rather National with opportunity than New Zealand First. Now, I completely appreciate that the opportunity tax policy is not really in line with anything National believes, and I agree with that. And I watched Kulei Wong on the Herald now during the week, and there's definitely way more alignment between opportunity and Labour. But at the end of the day, opportunity of the party is looking forward. They're looking at solutions, looking at creative solutions to try and deal with some of the problems we have. New Zealand First is doing the exact opposite of that. They don't acknowledge the big problems our country's got coming, and they try and take the country backwards. So,
Period.
take a pick. Don't. We always say don't vote based off vibes, but the general vibe in the sense of what opportunity you're doing is far more, at least it's productive and forward looking, unlike New Zealand First. So those are my thoughts. What are your thoughts on it, Alex?
Yeah, I'm with you, Eve. Look, I thought I wasn't sure if I was a little bit delulu or whether I, just kind of like speaking to how much trust I have in Chris Luxon. But yeah, I still think that National would consider them down the line. The New Zealand Herald's poll of polls put them this week at above 5%, which means they're in Parliament. Yes, of course, there's 3 months to go until the election. In fact, we've just hit under 100 days to go. But if the numbers are there to avoid a coalition with New Zealand First, why wouldn't you do that? Like, it just makes absolutely no sense to me why you wouldn't want to go that way. Because let's be clear, at this point, the statement's been made that National appears that they would rather work with the party that is blatantly racist, blatantly sexist, focused on this us versus them mentality and sowing more division just to get attention votes, rather than the party that, sure, is new to Parliament and has some different ideas. But like you said a few weeks ago, Eve, as to why some of our friends are interested in opportunity, they don't have that sort of baggage like New Zealand First. And as you said just now, like, they are looking future forward and towards solutions. And it's also weird to me, I guess, because Christopher Luxon said that they wouldn't sort of form a coalition with a party that would be interested in bringing in new taxes. But I think Opportunity leader Kulei Wong has said that their tax policies aren't necessarily a bottom line for them. So I just feel like this is really premature to have said, because I feel like it's really going to take away from any sort of negotiating power in 3 months' time, if Luxon's already sort of ruled them out,
Yeah, and I think it's also been interesting as well. As I don't know if anyone's seen around Auckland, they have these big these big billboards sort of saying how Labour, Greens, and Te Pāti Māori are going to give you more taxes. Look closely next time you see one of these, because opportunity has now been added to these. So these billboards now say, they were saying like 3 new taxes or taxing whatever, and now they've got 4 new taxes, and you've got 4 different colours on these billboards. I assume they're in other places of the country as well. So again, National keep talking about them, which I just focus on. We need to focus on ourselves. Like, we need to say why voters should vote for National, and not just say why don't vote for them. I also think as well that the tax stuff, the conversation with opportunity is interesting, because whilst I don't agree with their land tax policy, I think that what I like about them though is they're prepared to have a conversation about tax. I do find it frustrating that we have hit this impasse in New Zealand. We were incapable of having a conversation about tax, because every time it's just like all the the very extremes. National, like, oh, nope, anytime you mention tax, we're going to be taxing people more. And you got the Greens, there's one of massive big wealth taxes in, which some modelling's come out to show these actually are silly ideas. So I think it's we can't sort of have an adult conversation, and I think it's what Kulei Wong's saying. We just need to have a conversation about it.
Yeah.
The bottom line is we have an ageing population in New Zealand and declining birth rates. So how are we going to pay for it?
100%. I think it's interesting what you touched on about like focusing back onto like the national vote for those for the National Party and for those interested in voting for National, because some statistics from 2023 came out from where the majority of, I guess, then the Opportunity Party, as opposed to Opportunity as it is now, voters voted. In the last election, I think 23% of those who voted for National were thinking of then switching their vote to go to Opportunity. So, and that was more than, I guess, the other parties that had sort of switched votes to Opportunity. So while it does feel like Opportunity has some left-wing feeling policies, it is the centre-right vote that was mostly lost, I think, in that 2023 election. And National should be concerned about that. And I think that's probably why he's been like, oh, no, I'm going to rule them out. Yeah, look, I see what Luxon is trying to do here. Discount Opportunity and force them to look as though they now have taken a side, paint them as another left-wing party, but I really don't think that's the move. And I'm not sure if you saw the New Zealand Herald article this week, Eve, where Opportunity's $4 billion savings drive could result in public service job losses, with thousands of workers repurposed into new roles. Opportunity's plan includes $152 million in savings from Oranga Tamariki, for example. Granted, Wong did say that her party's universal basic income would pull families out of poverty, so there would be less violence against children, therefore less demand for services. But this is a policy that, as a sort of left-wing voter, I wouldn't subscribe to, and I wouldn't want to vote for. So there is a little bit of nuance to be seen here, and I just think Luxon painting Opportunity as something that perhaps it isn't is presenting a real opportunity, no pun intended, for this to go quite pear-shaped for him come November.
Yeah, and I think I'm going to probably reserve my position on if I think this is a good or bad decision yet, because I think, the one hand, there will be some National Party voters who, were just considering voting for Opportunity because they're disappointed with National, who will go, oh, no, I don't want to have the left in power now, so might come back to vote for National. But there'll be another category who'll be pissed off that Christopher Luxon has done this and will say, I'm absolutely going to vote for Opportunity now.
Yes.
So I think I'm going to be very interested when the next round of polls come out and we see if the sort of how if that all this affects Opportunity's vote. And the other point as well, and I think you've touched on this as well, like you'd be worried to vote for Opportunity because of the fear that they'd put the right in government. Yes. But actually, there are a lot of people who are not stoked with the Greens and Labour, who might go, well, actually, if they're not going to go with the right now, I can vote for them because they're going to go with the left. So there's lots of sort of, nuances and things to consider in that decision. So I'm going to be fascinated when the next round of polls come out to see if it moves anything, if at all.
Okie dokie. Shall we talk now, Eve, to AI data centers?
Let's do it.
Okay. Let's talk AI. Many of us use it in our day-to-day lives. Many of us have valid fears and concerns about it. Indeed, according to a KPMG study, only 44% of New Zealanders believe the benefits of AI outweigh the risks. That's the lowest ranking in any country that was surveyed in this KPMG study. New Zealand trails behind other countries in realising the benefits of AI. 54% versus 73% globally report experiencing benefits. And then New Zealanders also have some of the lowest levels of AI training and education, with just 24% having undertaken AI-related training or education compared to 39% globally. And this report also found that there is strong public support for AI regulation, with 81% of New Zealanders believing regulation is required. Specifically, 89% want laws and action to combat AI-generated misinformation, and only 23% believe current safeguards are sufficient to make AI use safe. And New Zealanders expect a comprehensive regulatory approach to AI. So, with that in mind, there is an AI data centre that has been consented to go ahead and start laying concrete in the ground, I think, in the next couple of months to, I think, go live in 2028 down in Southland. And this is definitely causing a little bit of a stir. And the Green Party have announced that they would like to have a 1-year pause or a moratorium on the construction of AI data centres. Now, I am actually here for this I think it would be prudent to have some time, and a year is not that much time, I will add, to do some focus groups and to work out some laws and regulations to safeguard AI, as well as use that time to get Kiwis on board and build trust. Because I think this is our, sort of industrial revolution kind of moment. And a lot of people just don't back it. We don't get it. We don't understand it. We can't trust it. And I think there needs to be a lot that goes into the sort of national conversation about AI usage and AI data centers. However, I will be critical, and I will say that I think the Green Party does need to be cautious not to appeal to a populist mentality of distrust in AI, because it's here, if we like it or not. And I think there does need to be care taken around language so as to not demonize it entirely.
Yeah, so I think this AI data center is quite an interesting issue, and I watched Chloe Swarbrick on Q&A last weekend discussing this, and I think my concern with if we delay it too much is the data sovereignty issue, because I think, as you said, AI is here and it's happening, and whilst I think Kiwis are a bit like, oh, how do we use this? What do we do about it? If we don't have our own data centers here, we're using data centers offshore, which means we don't have control over them, and we're also essentially just pushing our problems and all the problems that come with AI data centers onto other countries. So I do have some concerns with just delaying it. And if we delay it a year, and what if these findings find that people don't really want it? Well, it's here and we're using it, right? Like, what are we going to find? And I think the other concern I think I have with delaying as well is it feels like a little bit like a bit of a NIMBY type attitude, which if you don't want that, is a not in my backyard attitude. Is that there's people in Southland who are getting this data centre, potentially just don't want it to be where they are, which happens with everything. Anytime you do a development, roads, buildings, whatever, there's always people that live near it that don't want it. But I think the reality is we're going to have these. And I think what I did think Chloe had argument had some validity was around the environmental concerns. And so there have been some studies offshore that have sort of found, that potentially they do contaminate waterways and contaminate wetlands and areas around them. Now, that's something that we will have to work hard at. And I would expect, given how hard environments Southland are on dairy farmers, that they are equally as hard on people who put AI data centres in Southland as well. But I think also what was interesting from that interview with Chloe is that how bad is this actually environmental effects actually? And now people will be like, oh, all environmental effects are bad, and sure, they're not great. But the language Chloe was using was potentially quite inflammatory. She was saying it essentially just turns it all to sludge. And Tova actually said, well, what do you mean by that? And it seemed what you mean by it is the water goes a bit murky. But, in some of these places, it's not complete sludge, it's not maybe as bad as what Chloe has made it out to be.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. But I mean, you've seen, I think this is where some of the problem is that we have seen a lot of these AI data centers being built over in North America, in the United States particularly. And you've got videos, I think, of US Senator, Congresswoman. I'm so sorry. I don't quite understand all the time how their bicameral system works. I get a bit confused. But holding up the jar of water from, or sludge water, murky water. The semantics that really, I think Tova and Chloe really got into in that Q&A episode. But just really trying to convey to people what the environmental effects were from these AI data centers being built up. Now, I think the environmental concerns is really, really important. As we've seen in the US, I think the three big ones are probably sound pollution, effects on water, and energy concerns. I think the AI data centre that has been given the green light to go ahead in Southland has consent to draw up to 220 million litres of groundwater per year. That is roughly equivalent to 7 Southland dairy farms, which I guess, in that perspective, it doesn't sound too bad. I'm genuinely not familiar enough with AI data centers or water take consents to appreciate how much is too much. But honestly, for me, I feel like the bigger concern for me is the energy usage. This AI data center will take up 6% of our nation's energy, which is equivalent to the power used by more than 300,000 households. So the size of Wellington or Hamilton or something something like that. Um, and, you know, we've been having discussions over the past several years about energy usage and what we do in dry years as the grid, you know, is the grid able to handle that? Well, I think we know if the AI data center was to be up and running tomorrow, the answer is no. The grid would not be able to handle that. And it would drive up energy costs for ordinary public citizens in our own homes. So I think energy is probably the main thing that I'm really concerned about when it comes to AI data centers. And I think there needs to be some strategic planning around how we get people investing into AI data centers. Because, look, it's here. We need to move forward. We can't be left behind, I do think. But how these AI data centers might actually make us more sort of sovereign and resilient by this investment from people who want to, yeah, invest into our national grid.
Yeah, I think the energy thing is interesting. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there is some requirement they've got to produce some forms of renewable energy as part of these AI data centers.
So, yes.
Yeah, so I think there is some requirement around that. And I also think as well, there have been with the fast track bill, there have been more renewable energy projects that have been consented. But I completely agree. I think that's probably my biggest concern is that I'm not sure if you saw there was a post that came out, I think it was this week from Transpower maybe, on social media saying that it's really cold at the moment, and whilst we're not running out of energy now, be careful was kind of the vibe that the post gave out. And I was like, wow, this feels like we're living in a third world country that because we have a cold morning in New Zealand, the grid can't cope. So there's absolutely concerns around that. I think though if we can get to a position where the AI data centers are required to produce some of their own power, then I think that's a very good thing, and hopefully that will kind of help alleviate that issue and the concerns on our current grid.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think another thing that I am sort of somewhat concerned about is kind of understanding who benefits from this all. I read an interesting article from a PhD candidate at Auckland University by the name of Angus Dow. And Angus said that, quote, for countries hosting this infrastructure, AI data centers, the relationship can become uneven, with hosts supplying the land, energy, and networks, while key decisions about how these systems operate, are often made elsewhere. So, yeah, I think it's also opening up an interesting conversation about who is going to benefit from these AI data centers. You're right, I think, in terms of that data sovereignty. Also, another thing with the AI data center down in Southland is that the South Island is going to get a new cable in the Tasman Ring network, which is a 6,000 kilometre subsea cable, which will give the South Island a direct connection to Australia rather than sort of routing everything through Auckland. DataGrid claims that this is going to reduce latency by up to 35%, which is essential for AI workloads. So that's also a really good positive thing, I think, for the South Island. It kind of sounds like faster, better, more resilient internet and data down south. So I'm all good for that. So look, there are some benefits, but I think we should also be quite conscious of who is going to profit off of all of this, whether it's going to affect us environmentally. It's a real jumble jamble.
And then I did also see as well that Southland one will create 300 jobs, I think I saw. So there's also that benefit as well, like the benefits of the local community of having, of people getting to be employed. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, who owns these and who's putting them in is definitely something that, another discussion that, will have to be had. But the discussion, I personally think the discussion should be framed in a way of, okay, it's here. How do we do this? Not, let's not do this. I think it's quite important that it's framed in that form of way because, as we've both said multiple times, AI is coming and what's here to here and people are using it. So it's sort of like, how do we want to be on board with it and what's best for New Zealand?
Okie dokie. Now, as we finish up, as always, we are going to do our social media moment of the week. Have you ever done a dirty delete, Eve? Posted something that you didn't quite go your way and had to delete it?
100%. And to be fair, normally it relates to, when you're 13 or 14 and you're posting on Facebook, and then when you get a Facebook memory come up, or, you post something and someone gets upset. Absolutely. Thankfully, not for a while, but there is still the odd memory that pops up that I'm like, delete.
I do that too. I think that's the best use of Facebook memories and stuff. And like, on this day, and I'm like, see ya.
That doesn't need to be available for the world anymore.
No. So a dirty delete, that is exactly what the Taxpayers Union did this week when it posted on Facebook its own poll asking viewers to react with a like or an angry react as to whether they support a wealth tax. I guess just a little forward, the New Zealand Taxpayers Union is a political advocacy group, and it campaigns for lower taxes, reduced government spending, and greater transparency, and what it describes as better value for taxpayers. Personally, I'm a little bit critical of that. They claim to be non-partisan, but definitely have a free market and fiscally conservative sort of agenda. And I also think they are quite guilty of cherry-picking information to emphasise their views. Do you agree, Eve?
I actually exposed myself here, but I did work for the Taxpayers Union for a little bit. Back in university days, look, I definitely don't agree with everything they do. I think that they're essentially just a right-wing lobby group. In the same way that you've got, you have like Federated Farmers as a right-wing lobby group, but then on the left you've got the Teachers Union. They're essentially, that's kind of what they are, whether they like to be or not. And sometimes as well, like some of their staff that work for them have now gone to work for ACT. So there does seem to be a bit of a line between the two. So they're definitely a right-wing lobby group. So I do think sometimes as well they just like to stir up quite a lot, and I don't always think it's that productive the way they approach conversations.
Yeah, I'm with you. Well, I found it very funny this week when they posted their own poll on Facebook, which clearly sought to, I guess, undermine the Green Party's wealth tax policy. They said in the post that wealth tax would lead to, quote, less investment, meaning fewer jobs and slower wage growth and a weaker economy for everyone. But when it received over 9,000 likes showing support for a wealth tax, compared to over 6,000 angry reacts against a wealth tax, it didn't fit their narrative and they deleted it. Not, of course, before many people, myself included, took screenshots and sent it everywhere. Very funny. I thought this was a real laugh. Taxpayers Union didn't quite go your way this time.
Yeah, I think this is hilarious because, I personally think a wealth tax is a terrible idea. And as I said before, there's been some stuff that's come out that showed that it'll just drive rich people to just put their money offshore and so they'll get around it. But the fact that, like, the people that follow that social media page, clearly were in support of it was hilarious. So I suspect they might be a bit more careful before they post this sort of stuff in the future.
Oh, too good, too good. Okay, well, Eve, really awesome chats this week. Enjoy your time in the Gold Coast, and otherwise we will see you next week for an interview with ACT MP Laura McClure. Very exciting.
Thanks so much for listening, everyone. And as Alex said, we've got an interview out with ACT MP Laura McClure. I really, really enjoyed chatting to her. We kind of cover a whole range of topics, to be honest. And I think she sort of gives a really good explanation, I guess, of the sort of that conservative right approach to politics. So, be sure to tune in next Sunday when that interview's out.
Awesome. Until then, ka kite.